Dot Hack is an interesting series. It's an attempt at a huge multimedia epic that sacrifices accessibility for an interconnected narrative that tells a larger story through smaller standalone stories, where a small detail given in a light novel will let you better understand what's happening in a video game, where despite wildly different tones and themes being found in different entries, they are all connected, and thus there's always a feeling that you are missing part of a larger picture. This intimidating setup is perhaps part of the reason why the franchise never really reached overwhelming success, especially in the West. Not that it doesn't have a fan base over here, but I think that someone looking to get into a series like this would more likely be drawn to something a little less impenetrable to newcomers. Especially when, at a first glance, you have no real indication what's an important main entry in the series versus what's a spin-off, and more importantly, what's good versus what's bad. Still, for some people, myself included, this type of vast interconnected narrative is a lot of fun, and seeing how all the small pieces fall into place is a rewarding experience. Knowing what piece to start with, however, is tricky, especially now that years after everyone thought it had died out, Dot Hack has returned with Dot Hack GU Last Recode, an enhanced HD collection of 3 PS2 RPGs with new features, updated gameplay, and an entire new chapter of original content, set to come out later this year. Several friends of mine have asked if this is a good place to start, and if not, what is a good place to start? The answer to that question is sadly more complicated than it should be, so I decided to make this video to hopefully help out a bit. I've got 2 goals here, the first being to briefly go over every major entry in the Dot Hack franchise to see if it would be a good starting point for people. The second being to hopefully put this entire series into perspective. For this purpose, this video is going to be part informational and part my completely biased opinion. I'm going to be avoiding any major spoilers here, but I will be talking about some of the basic premise stuff and how everything connects. Naturally, talking about later entries in the series spoils some of what came before, so if at any point in this video you find something that interests you, feel free to jump off and go dive in. But before I get into any of that, let's start with a very simple question. What is Dot Hack? Beginning in 2002, Dot Hack is a multimedia franchise about a virtual reality online video game and the people that play it. In this world, a 2005 online terrorist attack called Pluto's Kiss caused all computers connected to the internet to crash for 77 minutes. This creates a worldwide crisis, with the United States nuclear weapons being armed and almost deployed. Following this, the entire internet would be banned from public use for 2 years. The MMO that this series follows, The World, is the first online game to be released after the public became allowed to use the internet again, resulting in it becoming the most popular video game ever made. So ridiculous premise aside, what is Dot Hack? Well, it consists of no less than 12 video games, 3 full anime series, a bunch of anime OVAs, card games, magazines, and more manga and novels than I can even be bothered to count. Once you start getting into what is and isn't canon, and that sometimes canon information comes from non-canon material, it all becomes so convoluted that even longtime series fans have a hard time keeping up. So you can see why someone with no knowledge of this series may want some help figuring it all out. With that out of the way, let's start from the beginning. Dot Hack Sign is a 25-episode anime series about a player named Tsukasa that becomes trapped inside the game. He's unable to log out, but beyond that, he's not even sitting in front of a computer, he's physically inside the game. This series follows several characters as they try to figure out the mystery behind how and why this happened. Early on, Tsukasa gets in contact with a mysterious entity that spends most of the show convincing him to not worry about returning to the real world. This entity, as well as the mystery behind the sleeping girl she watches over, is an important setup for the rest of the franchise. However, within the show itself, it often takes a backseat to character drama. Because of it being the first piece of Dot Hack media released, and having a lot of setup that makes later entries have more weight, it seems like an easy pick for an entry point. However, a lot of potential fans might be turned off by its incredibly slow pacing, melodramatic dialogue, and focus on character interactions. I'm not going to beat around the bush, 90% of the show is just people standing still and talking, and it can get a little boring at times. It's also pretty unrepresentative of literally everything that follows it. I think if you are okay with a slow-paced drama that talks about why people play online games and seek online connections, then this is a really good starting point, as it gives you a great introduction to the setting and proper build-up to the mysteries that surround a lot of early Dot Hack stories. But if you think this looks boring, just go ahead and skip it. Most people do. Personally, despite its flaws, I like Sign a lot and appreciate what it has to say. I plan on making another video to talk more about this show specifically later on, because it deserves more than what I'm giving it here. So if you're interested, keep an eye out for that. For now, let's move on. The original Dot Hack video games were released on the PlayStation 2 between 2002 and 2003. They have no easy name to refer to them with, so fans have started calling them IMOQ, or IMOC, as a reference to their individual English titles, Dot Hack Infection, Dot Hack Mutation, Dot Hack Outbreak, and Dot Hack Quarantine. And for the purposes of this video, I'll be calling them IMOC. This was the core of early Dot Hack, the first branch of the series. You play as Kite, a new player to the world convinced to join by his friend Orca. During their first adventure together, Orca and Kite come across a mysterious young girl in white, and this is what I meant when I say talking about later entries spoil some of the earlier ones. Yes, the same girl that was asleep in Sign. She is Aura, and most of the first branch of Dot Hack revolves around her. What she is, why she was created, and what is trying to destroy her is a core mystery these games focus on. The other thing this game focuses on is that soon after this, Orca is attacked by a strange monster, causing the real-life player behind the character to fall into a coma. Kite is given the Twilight Bracelet by Aura, an item that allows him to hack the data of the game, hence the title Dot Hack, which he can use to combat the corrupted data that has infested the game. So he sets out to solve the mysteries surrounding the world and its creation, in hopes that he will find an answer as to why his friend is in a coma and how to wake him up. As you'd expect from any JRPG, you meet a huge cast of characters and deal with a bunch of subplots, with the core plots of solving the mystery of Aura and saving Orca last throughout all 4 games. Yeah, about that. These are 4 separate video games, and they really shouldn't be. Each one lasts you between 20 and 30 hours, but at least half of that will be grinding and filler. These games are very outdated, and the amount of grinding, not just for levels, but for items needed to continue the story, had any friends I tried to get to play them, even back when we were kids, calling it quits by game 3. I don't mean to suggest these games are all bad though, there's some really great storytelling going on here, plus the characters are a lot of fun, and the way you write emails with them and check the message boards is still better here than in games trying to do the same thing today. I recommend this as an entry point if, and only if, you really don't want to start with Sign, and are willing to put up with some pretty mediocre gameplay and endless repetition of crawling through the same handful of dungeons throughout the entire experience. That being said, it is also a pretty good entry point on its own. The story is interesting, the characters are entertaining, and it set the standard for the vast majority of the franchise that follows. From here, things get significantly more spin-offy. I'd recommend some of this stuff to people who watched Sign or played IMOC, as this stuff builds upon those. But if you found neither of those worth going through, most of this stuff can be skipped. The first up is Liminality, a 4-episode OVA series that released alongside the games. This series had the unique premise of being set in the real world as opposed to the world. So you saw characters dealing with how the events of the series are affecting those outside the game. It deals with some basic Dot Hack stuff. A character's friend has fallen into a coma, so they start investigating the game's history and creator. It's worth watching because of its unique setting in the series, and it provides some really good background details that help give context to some of what you see in Sign and IMOC. The best way to watch it is alongside the games, as that was how it was intended, each episode between each game. Or, if you don't play the games but watch Sign, watch this all together as an epilogue to Sign, and even then it'll provide you with some extra details that go a long way. I'd even go so far as to say if you decide to skip both Sign and IMOC, it's worth coming back to Liminality after a different entry point. It's just important that you don't actually start here, as its main benefit is showing a different side of the story. As a small side note, the Liminality DVDs have these extra features that supposedly contain extra lore bits to help explain plots of the games. These extra features on the DVD are considered non-canon. Supposedly they were created by the people that put the DVDs together, and later stuff has since retconned all of it. So if you happen to have the physical DVDs, watch the OVAs on them, but don't worry about any of the hidden details on the DVD itself. Moving on from video games and anime to novels, AI Breaker is a light novel set even before Sign, following 2 characters who begin taking care of a mysterious young girl in white that is actually not the girl in white from the previous entries. It's a neat little side story that has a cool twist, but ultimately doesn't add much to the series overall. It's worth reading if you liked the games, but otherwise it's fine skipping. AI Breaker 2 is a collection of short stories, some of which follow AI Breaker and some tying into Sign, but it's even less relevant than the first, and it's obviously not a good entry point. Another Birth is another novel series, this time being a retelling of the 4 games, but from the perspective of Black Rose, a major character from the games. I've never read these myself, but I've heard mostly good to mixed things. Some have said they're good alternatives to the games, while others say they make things worse. Either way, it's technically non-canon, so it's up to you to decide if reading these novels are worth your time more than playing the games. This will likely take less time and certainly include less grinding, so I can't exactly blame anyone that takes this path, but either way I wouldn't start here and only recommend it to someone who watched Sign and Liminality that doesn't want to play IMOC itself. Another retelling of the games is X-Forth, or XXXX, a 2-volume manga series that sticks less closely to the plot than Another Birth, instead being a what-if story that reimagines a previously voiceless boss character from the games as a fully fleshed out character. It's a neat side story, but unlike Another Birth, there's no chance of this replacing the games, so it's only recommended to people who have either been through the games or Another Birth already. Dot Hack Fragment is a PS2 RPG released on November 23, 2005. Named after the in-lore prototype build of the world, this game was an online RPG in the worst way possible. It wasn't an MMO, but you could go into one of the endless, repetitive fields and dungeons from the previous games with other players. There was also an offline mode that served as a strange retelling of IMOC with elements and characters from other .hack media. It was never released outside of Japan, and was only online for around 2 years. To me personally, it seemed more like it was made to quiet the fans who wanted the world to be turned into a real MMORPG than it was to actually meet those demands. Either way, the game was a failure in pretty much every way possible. It does have its fans though, and some of those fans have even put up fan-made servers that are still running today, so if you really want to get some friends together and give this a go, I've never done it myself, so good luck. There are a couple other manga and novel series set during this part of this franchise that didn't get an English release, such as .hack 0. There are also some OVAs like Gift and Unison. If you see things with these names, just know they aren't good entry points and only worth looking into once you've been through all the stuff already listed, as they are also normally of questionable canon and /or quality. The only other major part of this branch worth talking about for our purpose is Legend of the Twilight, or Legend of the Twilight Bracelet. Both are correct. While at first glance you may think this is another retelling of the games, it's actually a sequel, and that's not even Kite and Black Rose, it's Shugo and Reina, 2 siblings who win a contest to obtain the character data of Kite and Black Rose. As Shugo gains the Twilight Bracelet, the same item Kite had, he becomes involved in the mystery surrounding this young girl in white. You may be noticing that .hack likes to repeat plot ideas a lot. The main difference here is that Legend of Twilight is a lighthearted comedy, a very sharp change of pace from the melodramatic stone-faced seriousness of everything else. It was originally a manga series that was later adapted into an anime. The manga is short and ultimately harmless, the anime is pretty bad. It has some fans, but ultimately I didn't get into its story or characters, and most of the time the comedy fell pretty flat for me, even back when I was a kid. It's worth checking out if you think a .hack comedy sounds neat. I'd say you should do it after the games, but honestly it stands on its own well enough that you could get away with giving it a shot at any point. If you're interested, the manga is the canon version of events, but personally I think none of it matters anyway because this is where Project .hack ends and .hack Conglomerate begins. .hack Conglomerate is starting off the second branch of the .hack series, where most of this stuff is only loosely connected to the stuff we've talked about up to this point, so we're going to be getting a couple of new good entry points. Following .hack's trend of setting itself in the near future, we're jumping from 2005 through 2010 to 2015 through 2017, where after a mysterious disaster, the game data and servers of the world are all destroyed. As a result, we now have the world R2, a complete reboot to the MMO of the originals. While some core data is carried over, and that's important to the plot of some things, most of it is entirely new. This is of course Dot Hack's way of starting fresh, shaking off all the baggage of its previous entries to reach a new audience. And so we have a brand new beginning, Dot Hack Roots. While Sign was in many ways a prequel to IMOC, it was also its own story. Roots is not. Roots is a prequel to GU in every way. It began airing as the first game was released in 2006, concluding with the release of the second game, but it's all set before the games. It follows the story of Haseo, who begins playing the World R2 only to be immediately tricked and killed by other players. This causes the teenage Haseo, and trust me, the fact that he's a teenager is critical to understanding his character, to be more reserved and hostile to the other players. He joins a guild run by Ovan and gets involved in their quest to find a mysterious item, along the way developing a one-sided crush on the character Shino. While I'd like to avoid spoiling things this far into any one of these, a midway event of Roots is the entire foundation of GU, so it has to be addressed. Halfway through the series, Shino is attacked by a strange character that looks like Kite, and as a result falls into a coma. The second half of Roots, and the GU games this is setting up, follow Haseo's quest to track down the thing that attacked Shino and save her from her coma. So it sounds like Roots would be a good starting point for this branch of Dot Hack, but unfortunately they made it more complicated than that. The last 2 episodes of Roots make the baffling decision to spoiler a major plot twist from the end of the second GU game, so I honestly can't recommend Roots here. GU does start off with a very quick recap of the beginning of Roots, as well as Haseo's fight against the Kite lookalike, but if you really want the extra background info and understanding that Roots provides, watch until episode 24. Do not watch 25 or 26 before finishing the second game of GU. It isn't a perfect solution, but it's one some might enjoy taking. If you decide to ignore Roots for now, the GU games don't lose too much from its exclusion. GU is probably the most popular thing from Dot Hack, so this is where a lot of people started. It's 3 video games, all still for the PS2. It still has some outdated gameplay designs and some awkward pacing, but it's vastly improved from the previous games. The lack of a 4th game here doesn't make GU feel any shorter than IMOC, it's just that we've had that much grinding cut out. While the plot here does get as interesting as other Dot Hack entries, a higher focus here is put on big anime action and drama. I often call the GU games the shonen anime take on Dot Hack. If that means nothing to you, think of things like Naruto or Bleach. It's a shift from the philosophical melodrama to teenage angst. It's not a bad change, it's just very different. Rather than characters standing around talking about the creation of the world or the nature of AI, you have characters screaming at each other and harvesting the strength of their emotions and the power of friendship. Whether that's a positive or negative is honestly up to your own personal tastes. That being said, Haseo's growth as a character is legitimately entertaining to watch, and by the end of the trilogy, it does move closer to something like the older games, with the added benefit of better written characters. While personally I prefer the style of the originals and think GU is better appreciated with at least Sign, IMOC, and Liminality behind you, it's undeniable that this is a better starting point than any of those. It's more accessible, more enjoyable to play, and much more mainstream. It also doesn't entirely ruin the stuff that comes before, so it's possible to go back, although playing IMOC after the gameplay improvements in GU may be a bit of a struggle. As I mentioned at the start of this video, we're getting the further enhanced Last Recode on PS4 and PC soon, with an extra 4th volume of content. It'll be by far the easiest Dot Hack to get into at that point. Last Recode will even come with the terminal disc files, originally released alongside the limited edition of Volume 1. This terminal disc goes further into the backstory of the world and recaps IMOC. Just be careful, that big Volume 2 spoiler is hinted at there as well, and some of the new lore terminal disc add isn't too great in my opinion. Still, it's really nice that it's included. As with the previous branch of Dot Hack, these games are followed by an onslaught of spin-offs and retellings. We've got the GU novels and the GU Plus manga, 2 different retellings of GU that both branch off into their own plot near the end. Neither are replacements for the games, but if you finish up GU and absolutely need to see Haseo's story told 2 more times, they've got you covered. We've also got the CGI movie GU Trilogy, another retelling of the games, but with a much shorter runtime. It's far less comprehensible as a standalone plot. Worth watching after GU to see some of those cutscenes in movie-quality CGI, I guess, but other than that, it's pretty pointless. Returner is an OVA epilogue that seems to have been made non-canon by Last Recode, so it's ignorable for now unless further information proves me wrong. Moving away from retellings, Dot Hack Cell is one of the few original novels set during this branch of Dot Hack, taking place during the time of Roots. It follows the character Midori and the mysteries surrounding her. Lots of crossovers with Roots and GU characters, so only recommended reading after playing GU. I've read Volume 1, but by the time Volume 2 was out, I had honestly lost interest in Dot Hack, so I can't really give my opinions on it. There's also some other spin-off manga like Alcor, but similar to the really obscure spin-off stuff from the original Dot Hack, if you see them, know they are minor and only worth looking into after you've been through the other stuff on this list. And that concludes the GU branch of the series. Moving on from that, we have what was originally considered a third branch, although now is also sometimes considered just a continuation of what was referred to as the Dot Hack conglomerate. While GU had started straying away from what a lot of people liked about early Dot Hack, it was also really good on its own merit and brought even more people into the series. From here on out, though, a lot of Dot Hack stuff started getting really bad. Not everything after this point is entirely worthless, as I'll get into, but the drop in quality is noteworthy, as is the fact that we started seeing less and less of this stuff getting English releases. First up is Dot Hack Link, originally a manga series and later a PSP RPG. Once again, we have a brand new version of the world RX, set in 2020 and following middle school student Tokyo. After an encounter with a mysterious girl at his school, Tokyo gets caught in the middle of a battle between the Twilight Knights, a group composed of old Dot Hack main characters like Kite, Haseo, and Tsukasa, and this evil mysterious group whose name is on the screen right now. The manga lasted 3 volumes and was made non-canon when the PSP game took its place. The game had you visiting AI recreations of all past Dot Hack stories, bringing in tons of characters from all across the franchise, even obscure stuff like AI Buster and non-canon stuff like X-Forth. It was meant to be a celebration of Dot Hack to serve as a potential closing chapter, despite the fact that it ends on a cliffhanger. It's also really bad, both in terms of gameplay and story, and the plot is probably the furthest thing you can get from an entry point. Though, to be fair, I haven't played it myself. It's possible everything I've heard and read about it is misrepresentative. Thankfully, there is a group of fans that have been working on a fan translation for several years now. It's nearing completion, so if you're a Dot Hack fan that has always wanted to see this thing for yourself, head on over and check it out. I'll put the link in the description. I'll also probably be playing it at some point once the fan translation is over, so I'll have more opinions of my own then. Link also got a web novel sequel/epilogue called Dot Hack Bullet, which is obviously only recommended for anyone who has already played Link. This was followed by Dot Hack Quantum, a 3-episode anime OVA also set in the world RX, circa 2022. The story is mostly self-contained, following Asumi and her character Sakuya, both online and offline. It's a neat style to see both, and constantly be swapping between the real world and the online MMO. Quantum, to me, shows how Dot Hack could have evolved as a series and adapted to the style of anime that was more popular in 2011 when it was released. It's got likable characters, decent dialogue, and perhaps for the first time, actually good animation. I also like its setting a fair bit, as we've reached far enough in the Dot Hack timeline that it can still feel like the near future even while watching it today. It still has its fair share of negatives holding it back, the first being that yes, the main character is another Kite lookalike, this time alongside a Black Rose and Balmung lookalike. This makes our 4th character with this look, and this is where it starts to become boring. But don't worry, if you thought the plot wasn't about the main character's friend falling into a coma and their investigations into the mysteries of the world in order to save them, it is. Thankfully, there's also a more original plot happening alongside this, as well as some honestly cool new concepts. The problem is that none of it really gets fleshed out, and the ending is pretty terrible, undermining everything that it had been building up to for its entire runtime, and cutting short any emotional investment you may have had. Those issues aside, it's a cute little OVA series that is definitely worth watching once you've gone through some of the other Dot Hack material, so definitely not a good starting point. Next up we have Dot Hack the Movie, also known as Dot Hack Beyond the World. This CGI film was released in 2012 and continues a lot of what Quantum was trying to do, switching between the real world and the online game. Set 2 years after Quantum, during the summer of 2024, the world has once again been rebooted, this time as the world Force Era. Yuki Sora is a middle school student and seemingly the only human left alive that doesn't play the world. Once she gets her obligatory kite-based character and meets up with her friends, including more IMOC lookalikes, she becomes hooked. From there, the movie follows a fairly standard and predictable storyline. Just take a guess what happens to one of her friends and sparks her investigation further into the world. See, that's the main problem with a lot of later .hack. Even when it's not bad, it's just that it doesn't seem to have any new ideas, which makes it rather uninteresting for longtime series fans. That being said, while I didn't care for this much in 2012, upon rewatching it for the sake of this video, I actually found myself enjoying it a lot more. It still has its problems, but it's a pretty cute and harmless standalone movie, and probably the best we could have gotten from a .hack movie. The animation style takes a little bit to get used to, but I actually found myself quite fond of it once we got into the game itself. I'd say if you don't want to start with Sign or GU, this makes for another pretty good entry point. The main character being completely new to the world makes it easy for newcomers to identify and learn with her, and it gives you just enough small details about Aura to further entice you to go back and learn what her deal was in the earlier entries. The only real downside to starting here is that it never got an official English release, so you'll have to rely on fan subs. Those fan subs can range from pretty okay to pretty terrible, so you'll have to do some research on which versions you come across, which I won't be getting into here. Packaged with the Blu-ray release of the movie was the only PS3 .hack game ever released, .hack Versus, a very basic fighting game based on the series. Set within a fighting game version of the world, this sees returning characters from all across the franchise with a story that tries to connect to Link and more of the modern stuff. While I've never played Versus due to it not coming over, I did watch the OVA that unlocks when its story mode is complete. Thanatos Report. This OVA is single-handedly the reason I stopped caring about .hack. To say it's bad is an understatement. It's baffling. I would love to talk about just how bad it is and how a single OVA ruined the entire plot of the franchise for me, but that would require spoiling stuff from early .hack entries that this retcons, and I'm not willing to do that here. Maybe one day I'll make a separate video going into just how bad this thing is, but for now just know that if at any point in your .hack adventures you see a reference to a group called Mama, get as far away from it as you can. We're almost done, but for the sake of completion, there's 2 more games to talk about. The first is Guilty Dragon, The Sin Dragon and the 8 Curses, a free-to-play online RPG for mobile devices released in Japan in 2012. While at first glance it may not seem like a .hack game, it's actually set in another brand new version of the world called The World Armed Conflict. And don't you worry, it has its own brand new version of Kite. As this game was never released in English, and in 2012 I certainly didn't care about mobile games or .hack, I know very little about this. It ended in 2016, so even if you were interested, there's nothing you could do about it now. As Guilty Dragon was ending, however, another .hack mobile game was starting. New World Volume 1, Maiden of Silver Tears, later known as just .hack New World, was supposed to be the start of a .hack revival project known as Project NU. But after less than a year of service, it also shut down, seemingly dropping its Volume 1 moniker somewhere along the line. And that's where we are. While the series clutched on to life through mobile games in Japan, over in the West it really died out after all the GU stuff. I think in a lot of ways Last Recode is a final chance for the series. It's a chance for them to go back to the last time it was really good and use that to recapture its old audience and perhaps gain a new one. So if you're part of that new audience and interested in .hack, the best entry points I would recommend are either Sign, GU Last Recode, or the movie. They're probably the best entry points you're going to get and the ones with the least baggage. I think from there you can branch out to almost anything else on this list that sounded interesting to you, because once you get your foot in the door, a lot of the other stuff just starts to fall into place. As for me, I'm sure I'll have plenty to say about Last Recode once it comes out, so if you'd like to see that, feel free to stay tuned. If for some reason you're interested in hearing more about my opinions right now, I do a podcast with my friend Rosin over on his channel. I'm also on some of his Let's Plays and streams over there. In particular, we just finished playing through the first Drakengard game, so feel free to give that a go. And if you've watched this video without knowing who Rosin is, check out his other videos too. They're way better than anything else you'd find on my channel. Links to all that stuff are in the description. If you'd rather not follow any of the stuff, that's fine too. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video, and hopefully I helped you get a grasp on this ridiculous series.
This shindig looks like the bomb diggity.